The years that followed my oath did not feel like years at all. They dissolved into a single, unbroken act of standing, of watching, of existing as a blade held at permanent attention. And in that endless continuity, the Imperial Palace became less a place and more a condition of being. A labyrinth of marble and gold and blood in which the only thing that truly moved was time slipping through our gauntleted fingers while we pretended not to feel it. The first century on the throne guard was the easiest, though no mortal would recognize it as such. Every moment was still fresh with the echo of his living voice, the memory of that hand on my shoulder, the certainty that my presence at his side mattered in some tangible way. I stood at the edge of the Eternity Gate, armor pristine, spear held upright, watching tides of humanity surge toward a glory they were never meant to touch. Pilgrims came in waves, their faces upturned and raw from the punishing winds of terror's polluted atmosphere, their lungs scarred by a lifetime of manufacturing fumes, their knees already bleeding from the prostrations required to even enter the outermost courts. They had walked, crawled, bargained, bled their way across light years for the chance to glimpse a distant silhouette of the Golden Throne, most knowing they would die in the attempt, all believing that their suffering would be seen, tallied, rewarded. They could not know that by the time they reached the inner sanctums, their bones would be too fragile, their minds too brittle, their souls already worn thin by the journey, and that those who actually set eyes upon him would do so for the briefest instant, before collapsing into dust under the weight of radiance they were never designed to endure. It fell to us, the Custodes, to regulate that flow of devotion, to decide which faces, in the endless sea of supplicants, might be allowed to take one step closer to annihilation in his presence, and which would be turned away with a blessing from a priest whose faith masked the cruelty of mercy. I vetted them not as individuals but as probabilities. Which of these souls would offer the least disruption if they disintegrated screaming at the foot of the throne? Which would inspire the most useful myths when their families learned that they died in the Emperor's sight? Sometimes, in the quiet moments when the hymnals faltered and the palace's vast lungs wheezed under the strain of cycling atmosphere for billions, I watched the processions with a curiosity that cracked dangerously close to compassion. I saw a mother present the ossified hand of her son, killed by orcs on some nameless frontier, and beg that it be laid at the Emperor's feet. I saw a veteran of the Astra Militarum, with half his body replaced by crude bionics, stand trembling on the cusp of the sanctum, refusing to kneel because he had spent a lifetime rising from the mud, and would not bow except in combat. I saw a child no more than 8 Terran years old, blind from birth yet led forward by a father whose faith burned so fiercely it was almost a physical force, both of them believing that a single glance from the master of mankind would restore the boy's sight. I denied them all access, not because I did not wish for their miracles, but because I had seen the truth. The Emperor, bound to the Golden Throne, did not perform such wonders anymore, if he ever had. His miracles now were measured in the continued existence of the species, not in small kindnesses dispensed to the faithful. The priests hated me for that, though they dared not say it aloud. The ecclesiarchy preferred a narrative in which the Custodes were austere but ultimately indulgent, golden saints allowing the most dramatic devotions to bear fruit. They did not understand that allowing those people to approach would have killed them instantly, and gained nothing but waste. We preserved lives by breaking hearts at the palace doors. It was a mercy I learned to deliver with a face, so still it might as well have been carved into my helm. Beyond the public rituals of access control and ceremonial guard, there was the true work of the Silent Watch, the tasks no choir sang about, the operations no scribe recorded in his data slate for fear that writing the words would draw the eye of powers even the Imperium dared not name. The palace is not just a fortress. It is a wound-in reality, an open channel through which the Astronomicon howls its psychic beacon across the nightmare ocean of the warp. Thousands of psychers are fed into its hunger every day, their minds milked dry by tortured machinery until their last screens become part of the light that guides the Emperor's fleets. The average citizen sees only the metaphor, a sacred beam of his will cutting through darkness. The truth smells like burning hair and copper and the stale ozone of overtaxed null fields. I have walked the halls beneath the beacon chambers, have heard the chorus of doomed voices swelling and fading as their bodies are consumed. To keep a galaxy from losing its way, their agony seeps through the walls. It curls beneath the marble floor. It flickers in the periphery of our enhanced senses like unfortunate ghosts. Some of my kind learned to shut it out entirely, to treat the psychers as fuel the way a ship's captain thinks of Prometheum, necessary, costly, and ultimately forgettable. Others, myself among them, could never quite reduce those lives to numbers. We knew that if even one psychically gifted soul were spared for pity's sake, 1,000 ships might vanish into the warp without a guide, and so we did nothing. We intervened only when something tried to follow the screams back. Such intrusions began subtly. A cold spot in a hall that should have been warmed by geothermal vents. A momentary ripple in the air like heat haze where the stone sweated during winter cycles. A shadow turning its head in a fresco when no one moved. The first time I felt it, I was stationed in one of the inner galleries leading to the throne's antechamber. The gold inlay underfoot polished to a mirror sheen. The vaulted ceilings adorned with murals depicting the Emperor's victory. Over the traitor primarchs in colors so vivid they seemed wet. A scribe servitor shuffled past, its quill-tipped mechadendrites scratching at parchment without awareness, accompanied by 2 sisters of silence whose blank-eyed auras pressed against my thoughts, like pressure changes before a storm. As they passed, the air temperature dropped by several degrees. At first I thought it was simply the pariah effect of the sisters, the way their presence thinned the warp's murmur to a dull ache. But then I saw it, a smear of darkness clinging to the archway ahead, not cast by any physical object, a stain in the air itself, and within it a suggestion of movement, something turning, something noticing. My spear was in my hands before the human mind beneath my augmentations had finished processing the threat. The sisters felt it too. Both turned their heads in perfect unison, their null auras sharpening like blades. For a heartbeat, the palace felt as if it were holding its breath. Then the smear of darkness thinned, stretched and vanished, leaving only the scent of smoke and old blood behind. No alarms sounded. No demons burst from the stone. No tech priest came running with censers and wards. The sisters inclined their heads to me in silent acknowledgement and moved on. The moment passed, but I knew then that the warp did not merely lurk beyond the gates of the palace. It was already pressing its face against the glass. Incursions near the throne itself were rare, but when they came like aneurysms, sudden, catastrophic and impossibly localized. One such event carved itself into my memory so deeply that even now, centuries later, I can recall it frame by frame as if it were etched into my skull. We were in rotation around the Sanctum Imperialis, the custodians forming a living circuit of vigilance around the throne's chamber while a conclave of Mechanicus representatives prayed and argued over the maintenance rituals necessary to keep the Golden Throne from seizing in a catastrophic failure. Incense hung in the air like fog. The Emperor sat unmoving at the center of it all, a colossal silhouette of gold and bone and baroque life support systems, his features obscured by the glare of 1,000 lumens arranged to make him look less corpse-like, and more like the statues in the outer halls. I had learned early on to avoid looking directly at him while on watch. The combination of psychic pressure, religious dread, and simple horror was too much even for a mind grown in a forge. Instead, I watched the people in the room, the way the magi bowed, the way the scribes trembled, the way even high lords tried and failed not to stare at the ritual sacrifice of psychers, feeding into the throne's conduits. The air was thick with whispered binary, recited litanies, the low thrum of engines old enough to have outlived entire civilizations, and beneath it all, a sound most mortals could not hear, the low, strained, almost metallic pulse of the Emperor's presence being forced through failing channels. The first sign of failure was not visual or auditory. It was a taste, metal, sharp and sudden on the back of my tongue. Then the lights flickered. A pressure built in my skull, pressing outward, trying to force my eyes to see something beyond the visible spectrum. Across the chamber, one of the psychers in the feeding choir began to convulse, his restraints creaking as his body arched against them. The tech priests monitoring his vitals turned toward him in annoyance rather than concern. Convulsions were expected at that stage of the process, but this time, the Psyker's eyes did not roll back. They focused on the throne, on him, and he smiled. The sound that tore from his throat was not his own voice. There is a moment, a very specific moment, when silence becomes unbearable, when it shifts from a sign of peace into an omen of something broken beyond repair. And I first felt that transformation not during a crisis or a battle, or one of the throne's catastrophic failures, but in a quiet dawn on Terra when the sky beyond the palace windows was grey with ash, and the hymns of the morning shift had not yet begun. The Astronomican's pulse stuttered, just once, a flicker so brief even the most sensitive augurs failed to register it. Yet I felt it like a tremor in my bones, as if the universe itself had skipped a heartbeat. I was stationed on the dais of sanctity, my spear angled just so, my gaze scanning the chamber for any deviation from prescribed order, when a pressure behind my eyes tightened, a sensation I had felt only once before, the day of that Psyker's final laugh. A tech adept's servo arm paused mid-motion. A sister of silence turned her head slightly, the barest flinch. The throne's throne roots, that sprawling, obscene lattice of gold and cables and bone that burrowed into the floor, shivered. It lasted less than a breath. It resolved almost before my enhanced reflexes fully reacted. And yet when it passed, the chamber did not feel the same. Nothing had changed in any way that mortals could see. The lights still blazed. The incense still smoldered in heavy coils. The Emperor still sat in his eternal paralysis. But something under the surface had tilted, sharpened, grown raw. A quiet shift in the boundaries between life and death, duty and dread, faith and fear. I tried to ignore it. We all did. We were built to ignore anything that did not immediately kill or corrupt. But later that day, when I stood in the Gallery of Echoes, a long hall adorned with statues of custodians who died in the siege of Terra, their names engraved in gold beneath expressions carved from their actual death masks, I found myself staring at one face in particular, a warrior whose sacrifice halted a demon primarch's hand inches from the Emperor's throat. I had stood beside him once, centuries earlier, and I remembered him as unstoppable, brilliant. A being whose loyalty was so complete it shone like a psychic shield. But the statue was too still, too final. It struck me for the first time that even perfect devotion ends in silence, that we are all one breath from becoming icons in a hallway, admired by those who will one day replace us and pretend we were never alive at all. I forced the thought aside, marching on, holding discipline like a blade tight enough to cut into my own palm. Yet with every step the silence followed me like a shadow that had finally learned my name. The silence deepened with the passing decades, not the physical silence of the palace's vast cathedral halls, but the silence underneath that. The silence where his voice used to be. The Emperor once spoke to us, not in words but in light, in presence, in psychic radiance so profound that a single brush against it could tear away doubt like cobwebs from glass. When he walked among us, that radiance was blinding. Even after the throne claimed him, its echo endured for centuries. But now, I realized with horror, that echo was fading. Not all at once, no cataclysm, no alarms, no sudden collapse, but grain by grain, like a monument eroding into dust too slowly for most to notice. At first, we blamed ourselves. We sharpened our minds, deepened our meditations, honed our connection to him through ritual and discipline. When that failed, the Mechanicus blamed entropy in the throne's inner mechanisms. The Ecclesiarchy blamed some great test of faith. The High Lords blamed each other. And through it all, I blamed nothing at all. Because to assign blame is to acknowledge that something is dying. One night, after a shift so long my legs felt carved from ceramite, I was summoned to a private convocation of the Shadowkeepers. Our secret custodial order tasked with guarding not glory, but horror, forbidden relics, unspeakable truths and prisons where the Imperium locks away threats too dangerous to destroy. The Shadowkeepers rarely request aid from outside their own ranks and never without cause. I arrived in the Vault of Woes to find a circle of custodians already waiting, their armor darkened to conceal the aureate brilliance the palace always demand. In their midst hovered a stasis field containing a scream, not a person, not a creature, but a scream frozen in time. It vibrated against reality, clawing at the walls of its containment with invisible nails. One of the custodians spoke. This was taken from the Astronomicon chamber 21 hours ago. The psycho who produced it lasted 3 seconds after the breach occurred. Breach. The word hit me harder than any blade. A breach meant something had pressed inward. Something had noticed him again. Something hungry. Another custodian stepped forward and lowered the stasis field a fraction. The scream pulsed, not in sound, but in pressure, a psychic wave that prickled against my implants. And in that tremor, I felt a message to Primal to be misunderstood. A god is weakening, and predators circle dying. Gods! We restored containment. We locked the vault. We spoke no further of it. But that scream never left my mind. It echoed in every silence that came afterward. Soon after, fragments of belief, that hidden, fragile poison we are never meant to hold, began to slip through the cracks of my perfection. I had always known, logically, that a custodian's purpose is not to be rewarded. We were forged to stand without comfort, to kill without hesitation, to serve without the luxury of meaning beyond the Emperor's continued existence. But the Emperor's continued existence had once been certain. Now it felt like a lie we repeated because the alternative was too devastating to comprehend. The Ecclesiarchy's sermons grew louder. The pilgrim lines grew longer. The wars across the galaxy multiplied like infections bursting from a corpse. And the Emperor remained unmoving, unspeaking, unhearing. I began to envy my predecessors, those who died in the Great Crusade, who saw him alive. Commanding, unstoppable. They died believing their god would never fall. We, the ones who remain, are condemned to watch him decay. One night, during a rare moment of solitude in the Chamber of the Throne Rites, where artisans maintained the ornamentation surrounding the throne, I stood inches from him, close enough to see the veins beneath cracked skin, close enough to feel the faint static hum that keeps his form anchored to this plane. His mouth was slightly open, frozen mid-breath. His eyes, once burning suns, were dull behind layers of drying, gold-flecked secretion. Tubes fed through his armor like worms burrowing into a corpse. If I had been less of what I am, the sight would have driven me to my knees in grief. Instead, it stripped me of something even more essential, certainty. I whispered, silently, internally, a question I had never dared to think before. Are you suffering? His body did not move. His presence did not swell. But somewhere in that suffocating quiet, I felt a pulse, not from him, but from the throne. As if the machine spirit wished to answer in his stead, he does not suffer. He endures. It was not comfort. It was indictment. Because endurance is what creatures do when there is no longer strength to prevail. I tried to bury this crisis beneath duty. I immersed myself in combat drills, in killing, simulations against enemies both real and theoretical, in patrols along the walls where terrors, poisoned winds tore at my cloak, in unspeakable tasks within the shadow vaults. But doubt is a parasite that thrives in immortal minds. The death of faith in a being like me is not a dramatic shattering. It is attrition cell by cell. There came a day when an alarm sounded from deep within the palace, a rare, deeply coded alert indicating a direct threat to the throne itself. I sprinted into the lower sanctums alongside a dozen other custodians, expecting demons or assassins or a malfunction threatening catastrophic systems collapse. Instead, we found a pilgrim, a young man who had slipped through 10 security perimeters and bypassed wards that should have turned his bones to dust. He knelt before a mural of the Emperor, bleeding from every pore, eyes wide with a serenity that sickened me. He spoke to me, the pilgrim said. He told me to come. He told me he is not dying. He told me he will rise again. His voice was calm to calm, and behind it, beneath it, around it, I felt a psychic discord, a vibration out of tune with the Emperor's true resonance. Before the sentence had even finished, one of my brothers executed him. A clean thrust of a guardian spear through the heart. The body slumped. The blood steamed. The palace fell silent again. We left without speaking a word. But inside, I knew the truth. That voice had not been the Emperor's. Something in the warp was speaking through the throne's weakening defenses. Wearing hope as bait. I thought that would be the worst of my realizations. I was wrong. The Emperor no longer speaks. The Emperor no longer commands. The Emperor no longer shields us with his will. And we, his perfect, immortal, unwavering guardians, are no longer certain he knows we stand here at all. The worst part? Humanity has not noticed. The Imperium's faith is too loud to hear silence. The galaxy burns, worlds consumed by tyrannid hunger. Chaos fleets rending reality, orc empires growing like tumors. Necron tomb worlds awakening beneath unsuspecting cities, and every soldier who dies believes the Emperor protects them. But I stand at his side, close enough to hear the machines breathing, close enough to feel the psychic vacuum his absence leaves behind, close enough to sense the cold truth that terrifies me more than any enemy ever could. The warp does not roar at first. It whispers, and those whispers are the most dangerous thing in existence. More than bolt of fire, more than blade, more even than the sight of a god bleeding, because they slip beneath armor and doctrine and gene-forged certainty to prod at the oldest, rawest parts of the mind, and for a long time I convinced myself I was immune to them, that my psychic resistance and my proximity to the Emperor's lingering presence made me untouchable. But the warp is patient and hunger is clever. And eventually it found a way to press its mouth against the cracks in reality, closest to the golden throne, and breathe. The first true sign came not in the shriek of alarms or the tolling of cathedral bells, but in a single, tiny deviation. A candle refused to go out. It was in a lesser shrine inside the inner palace, a place where lower functionaries left their desperate offerings, wax and bone and bits of parchment scrawled with pleas, that would never reach their intended target. Regulations demanded the shrine be sanitized every 48 Terran hours. We were not supposed to allow superstition to cluster too close to the throne. One evening, as part of that necessary blasphemy, I stood watching a menial acolyte snuff each flame in turn with a small brass cup on a stick, his eyes downcast, his movements mechanical. Every candle dimmed and died on command except one, a thin stick of wax in the center. Unremarkable in appearance, yet when the cup descended, its flame did not flicker. The acolyte frowned, tapped the wick, tried again. Nothing. I felt the disturbance before I understood it, a subtle dissonance in the air, like a string on a lute tuned half a note too high. The candle's flame did not glow gold like the others. It burned a faint, almost colorless white, with a thin rim of violet at its edges. I took 2 steps forward, every instinct suddenly unsheathed, and as my shadow fell across the shrine, the flame bent toward me, against the direction of the air currents, as if sniffing. The acolyte looked up, eyes wide. "My lord," he began, and then his pupils dilated until his eyes were nothing but black. His mouth opened and a voice not his own hissed up through his throat. "He is not looking any more." My spear moved faster than the echo of those words, the tip punching through bone and brain with a sickening crack. But the whisper had already coiled into the walls, crawled up my spine, brushed against the edges of my thoughts. The candle's flame flared in grotesque satisfaction and then guttered out on its own. The body collapsed in a boneless heap. To anyone else, it would have seemed an unfortunate but mundane psychotaint manifestation, another soul claimed by proximity to the Astronomican's shrieking chorus. To me, it was an announcement. Something in the warp was testing the palace, pressing its tongue against our defenses, learning the shape of our fear. It had found a way to speak through a nothing acolyte in a nowhere shrine, barely 50 corridors from the Golden Throne. That was not hunger yet. That was tasting. Hunger came later. The warnings grew stranger, more frequent, yet always deniable. A fresco in the outer cloisters that showed the Emperor triumphant over the ruinous powers began to warp at the edges when no one watched it. Later, when we interrogated picked skulls that had been recording for decades, we saw that the painted demons' eyes sometimes turned to follow passing psychers, their mouths curling into knowing smiles. A stone cherub carved into a lintel above a minor portal was found one rotation, with its granite hands pressed against its own ears. The expression on its face twisted into a silent scream. stone fingers stained with faint traces of soot that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A servo skull, tasked with routine observation of atmospheric conditions in the upper halls, began transmitting only a single picked feed, frame after frame of the Golden Throne. From angles it could not possibly access, the image desaturated and overexposed. The Emperor's face blurred into a smudge of shadow crowned with a halo of static. Tech priests blamed data corruption. The ecclesiarchy blamed insufficient piety. The High Lords blamed unreported heresy among the maintenance crews. We, the Custodes, blamed nothing and no one because blame implies control. And there is no control in the face of an ocean rising against the shore. There is only the knowledge that the waves will come again, and one day the stones will break. I remember the night it finally tried to break through. The alert came as a low-frequency shudder through the palace's bones, followed by a tight, clipped Vox transmission carrying a code phrase I had hoped never to hear in my lifetime. Sanctum Sigma Prime. Category Ascendant. Proximity Direct. There are very few places in the Imperial Palace where the word direct can mean anything. The throne's chamber is one. The Astronomican's core is another. This was closer to the former. I ran, golden boots hammering along marble corridors already thrumming with responses to the alert. Sisters of Silence glided through side doors, their blank auras pressing ahead of them like invisible spears. Tech priests scurried toward control nodes, mechadendrites thrashing, chanting Binharic ward codes. Lower-ranked palace guards flattened themselves against the walls as we passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and terror, the way mortals look at storms. As I approached the inner sanctum, the air grew thick, not with smoke or dust, but with a kind of psychic humidity, the flavor of unreality seeping through microfractures in every ward and seal. My autosenses flickered. For 3 heartbeats, my helm's targeting runes showed nothing but static. When they cleared, the sight that awaited me at the threshold of the throne's chamber carved itself into me. With perfect clarity, the Golden Throne was weeping light, not golden light, not the harsh, mechanical glare of lumen strips, but raw, unfiltered warp energy, bleeding out around his silhouette and pulsing. Sickly colors, violet, deepest red, a black so absolute it glowed at the edges. The air in front of the throne rippled as if reality were being slowly stirred by an invisible hand. The psychochoir that fed the Astronomicon was already dead, most of them melting into organic pulp inside their restraints. Their skulls split open from the inside by pressure they could not contain. A single Sister of Silence stood at the very edge of the warp bloom, her face contorted with effort as she held her null presence like a shield. Every vein in her body standing out, blood trickling from her nostrils and ears. Around her, 6 of my brothers had formed a ring, their guardian spears planted in the marble, power fields crackling, armor glowing with reflected corruption. They did not move. They could not advance without stepping into a storm that would tear their souls out. They could not retreat without abandoning the last barrier between that storm and the Emperor. I stepped forward, feeling the pressure hit me like an invisible wave, not a shove, but a pull, like hands reaching into my chest, testing the fibers of my being for places to grip and tear. For the first time, I understood, viscerally, what it means when they say that the warp is hungry. It was not merely power, not merely chaos. It was appetite, pure and merciless, directed now not at worlds or fleets or the galaxy at large, but at a single point of blinding, wounded light, him. It wanted what remained of the Emperor's soul, not just to destroy it, but to consume it, to make of it a feast that would fuel 1,000 nightmares. That knowledge did not come in words. It came in images forced into my mind, sons being devoured, saints screaming as their faith was turned inside out, golden statues melting into screaming, living flesh. I tasted copper and ash. I smelled burned hair and the sharp sweetness of overcooked meat. Voices, layered and discordant, whispered promises in languages older than humanity, freedom, vengeance, dissolution, union. At the center of it all, faint and flickering, there was still his presence, like the dying throb of a heart whose arteries have been cut. It did not command. It did not plead. It simply endured, holding its ground against a force that would have unmade any less a god. We moved, if I were a poet rather than a weapon. Perhaps I could describe the choreography of that battle. As it is, I can only recall moments, flashes of motion pinned against the overwhelming blur of warp assault. One brother stepped too close to the blooming rift and his armor cracked like eggshell, under forces no material was ever meant to withstand. His flesh bloated, split, stretched outward, fingers lengthening into talons before the sister's null aura collapsed. His corrupted soul into nothingness, leaving only an empty shell that fell inward like a collapsed tent. Another custodian drove his spear into the floor, activating ancient runes that called up a lattice of shimmering, hexagrammic energy, momentarily stabilizing the air around the throne. Tech priests, those who had neither fled nor gone mad, hurled themselves at cogitator banks and control levers, flooding localized Geller fields with power, chanting, "By the On Messiah, by the dragon in the deep, Titan, Titan." Hold! The warp answered with contempt. A disembodied claw, enormous and half-formed, pushed its way through the air, its edges fraying into tendrils of screaming faces. The sister at the forefront took a step forward, every movement a visible agony, and screamed without sound, her null field slamming into that claw with the impact of colliding planets. The thing recoiled, edges hissing as pieces of it vaporized under the assault of nothingness. For a moment, nothing, literal nothing, was stronger than everything the warp could throw. Perfection is a crown made of razors, and as the centuries uncoiled behind me like a serpent made of dust and memory, I discovered that the sharpest cuts did not come from battle, but from expectation, the demand that we, the Emperor's 10,000 hand-picked paragons, remain flawless even as the galaxy we protect disintegrates into chaos. And in that gulf between what we are and what we must appear to be, the cracks did not show on our armor, but in the quiet, hidden chambers where no mortal eyes could witness the collapse of our invulnerability. A custodian does not falter, so we learn to fail in secret. When a brother's strike was a fraction slower than doctrine allowed, we noticed the delay but never acknowledged it. When one of us stared too long at the throne, and his eyes glistened with emotions unfit for a guardian, we stood beside him without speaking. Our discipline became a shell, immortality polished so bright that no one could see the rot gathering underneath. I trained for centuries alongside brothers who once stood like mountains, unshakable and unbreakable, only to watch their movements drag infinitesimally, their reactions lag by imperceptible degrees, tiny degradations that would mean nothing to a mortal soldier but to us, who were sculpted into living instruments of precision measured against divine standards. Each flaw felt catastrophic. We were not allowed to speak of decline. To admit weakness in ourselves would mean admitting it in him. For our strength is a reflection of his will, and as his light dims, so do we. The Mechanicus called it entropy in our augmetics. Biological stresses accumulated across millennia, microdegeneration in neurosaptic sheathing. The ecclesiarchy called it a failure of faith. The High Lords called it impossible. Only we understood the truth. A truth that clawed at our consciousness like the warp's whispers had. Gods are not meant to be mortal long enough to wither, and neither are their guardians. It began subtly. We trained in the Hall of Blades, a chamber so vast its vaulted ceiling disappeared into incense fog, where hundreds of custodians sparred in perfectly choreographed brutality. Once, the sound of our practice was like thunder made of purpose, spears whizzing, armor striking armor with the musical perfection of a galaxy's heartbeat. But then, one day, I heard something out of place, a grunt of exertion, strained and pained, from a warrior who had never needed breath to steady his strikes before. I turned to see Brother Ito's stumble, only slightly, only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to expose a seam in his guard. That should never have existed. His opponent struck, a blow that would have removed a head in war. But at the last instant he halted, horror rushing into his face behind the helmet. Ito straightened immediately, anger rising, insisting it was a feint, a trick, a test, but we all saw the truth. Strength had left him. Not much, but enough. Later, I found him alone in the reliquary garden, surrounded by statues of martyrs and saints who never knew the weight of millennia. He was staring at his hands, massive, steady, capable of bending adamantium, and yet his fingers trembled. He saw me watching and tried to hide the shake behind a fist. "It's nothing," he murmured. "Just fatigue." We both knew there is no fatigue for the 10,000. There is only the slow unraveling of perfection. We did not speak of it again. But unraveling spreads. Cracks widen. Soon, errors that should have been impossible began to ripple through our ranks. A brother forgot a cipher he had etched into his mind 3,000 years earlier. Another hesitated when a petitioning priest approached the throne with an artifact. That radiated warp taint. That hesitation cost a second custodian his arm. Such failures did not become public. We erased evidence, sealed reports, rewrote internal archives to remove the shame, because if the Imperium learned that the Golden Legion was faltering, panic would race through the stars faster than any fleet, and the Emperor's worship must remain intact. Without belief, humanity would collapse in on itself in a frenzy of fear. So we buried the truth under gold. But truth has a terrible habit of growing teeth. There came a day, during weapons calibration in the Arena of Echoes, where every strike reverberates through the palace like the toll of a funeral bell. When Brother Illyrian faced me as sparring partner, he was an exemplar of our order, steady as Terra's crust, silent as a vow, deadly as a solar flare. Our spears met again and again in perfect timing until, mid-swing, Illyrian's grip shifted, the smallest miscalculation, the difference between perfection and death. My spear slipped past his defense, stopping a hair's breadth from his throat. He froze. So, did I, and then, to my horror, he flinched, stepping back as if the near strike had ignited fear. Fear, something we were sculpted to be immune to. I lowered my weapon and whispered through our private Vox link, a channel reserved for matters too shameful to speak aloud. "Brother, what is happening to us?" His visor remained forward. His breath rasped once, twice, then, in a voice so quiet no other could hear, he answered, "Entropy. It reaches even angels." That sentence should have been investigated as heresy. Instead, I nodded, because it was truth. As our physical perfection faltered, our minds, built to be fortress strong, began to crack where doubt pressed too hard. At night, in the stillness of the palace's upper galleries, some custodians could be found kneeling before forgotten alcoves, heads bowed. Not in worship, but in exhaustion. I once walked through the Hall of Repose and found Brother Vela sitting with his helmet off, staring into the distance with eyes that had witnessed 10,000 wars. "What are you looking at?" I asked. He answered without turning, "The futures in which we fail." I told him we would never fail. He smiled, not bitterly, but with a compassion that hurt. "You were forged later. You still remember hope." That was the first time I realized some of us were older than despair itself. We cling to purpose not because it is righteous, but because without it, immortality becomes a sentence worse than death. The palace priests do not see this. They kneel before statues and speak of eternal glory, eternal strength, eternal guardianship, unaware that eternity is a punishment none of us chose. The High Lords do not see this. They shout orders from the Senatorum Imperialis and send armies to die across the galaxy, unaware that the ones they call perfect are quietly breaking under the strain of centuries. Even the Adeptus Custodes, our genetic cousins twisted by war and faith, do not see this. They believe we are above them, eternal and inviolate. But we are not inviolate. We are exhausted. We are dwindling. And the Emperor we protect does not speak, does not see, does not command anymore. We are statues guarding a tomb none dare call a tomb. Still, we stand. In one of my darker moments, I stood alone in the Shadowkeeper's isolation vaults, staring into a containment field holding a relic so corrupting that even the demons who forged it fear its memory. I wondered, not aloud, never aloud, how different things would be if I stepped aside, just once, and allowed fate to swallow us whole. Every instinct rebelled against the thought. My soul, engineered though it is, burned in defiance. Even as I questioned our purpose, even as my belief withered into dry logic, my duty remained intact. That is the cruelty of our creation. We can doubt forever and still act without hesitation, because we were built not for faith, but for obedience to a purpose that no longer acknowledges us. Sometimes, late in the cycle when palace activity quiets and the klaxons do not scream, and even the warp seems to pause to breathe, I stand before the golden throne and imagine that, just for a heartbeat, his eyes will flicker open, that he will turn to me and place his hand on my shoulder as he did the day of my forging, that he will speak, that he will tell me the suffering means something. When that fantasy fades, as it always does, I remain locked in the same stance, a statue made of gold and doubt. Perfection demands that we show nothing of this. So, every flaw must be sharpened into strength. Every staggering must become a renewed pose of readiness. Every despairing thought must be converted into silent vigilance. We train harder. We push farther. We carve discipline into our spirits until it cuts deeper than fear. If our bodies falter, we compensate with technique. If our reaction time slows, we anticipate earlier. If our minds tremble, we anchor ourselves to duty so fiercely that doubt cannot pry us loose, because the Emperor cannot fall, and so we refuse to fall before he. Does the Galaxy may never know this chapter of Custodian history, the secret attrition of God forged. Warriors, because we will never allow our weakness to become their terror. Our silence is the shield that keeps humanity from realizing the truth, that the greatest warriors ever created now bleed in places no one can see, that the golden Fawade is cracking, that the last line of defense between mankind and extinction is tired, but tired is not defeated. We still rise from the training halls dripping sweat like molten oromite. We still maintain our armor until every plate gleams with unforgiving brilliance. We still stand beside the throne, motionless and vigilant as the universe claws at the palace doors. We still kill anything, mortal or monstrous, that dares to hope he is gone. We stand not because we believe we can win. We stand because as long as we hold this line, humanity is allowed one more breath, one more sunrise, one more prayer. Perfection is no longer what we are. Perfection is what we pretend to be.